Chapter 10. Hubert's fingers drummed across the oak frame of the old curio, the rough cracks cutting at the calluses of his magic-stained fingertips, his forehead pressed against the aged glass, the touch cooling, but doing little to ease the throbbing, stabbing sensation building in his temples. He continued to stare at the box of Morphisi warp gems, sans the one Ferdinand had used to spirit himself away, hoping the seemingly innocuous stones would reveal where their missing compatriot had departed. But nothing. The gems held their secrets. Ferdinand was gone, and Hubert did not have the faintest idea where he went. "You are absolutely sure he said nothing as he departed?" Hubert pulled back from the curio, massaging his temples, and shooting Sylvain a pointed look. Sylvain crossed his arms and glared. "Yes, Hubert, I'm sure," he growled. He pressed a palm to his forehead, likely to ward off a headache not so dissimilar to the one affecting Hubert. He ran his hand through a sleep-mused tangle of red curls. "Why else do you think I tried to break your door down at this hellish time of morning?" Outside, the night sky was still pitch black, as if to confirm Sylvain's irritable observation. No slivers of dawn had broken through the tangle of tree branches surrounding them. Even the songbirds had not yet begun their morning course. "You said he appeared upset when he left, yes?" Eileen frowned. She pulled the wool blanket she had draped over her shoulders tighter, swaddling herself in a cocoon of warm fabric. The candle, and its holder that had been in her grasp, was placed on the nearby table, the tiny flame illuminating the room in an eerie orange glow that only accentuated the creeping shadows. The dark, grey-streaked hair she normally had pinned away in a simple bun brushed past her shoulders and down her back in a gnarled wave of black curls, many of the strands sticking out at gravity-defying angles. "Yeah," Sylvain grimaced. The hand that had been nervously musing his own hair dropped limply at the side. The look on his face. I didn't think it was possible for Ferdinand to look that furious. "Is there anyone who Ferdinand has been in conflict with this last while?" Eileen inquired. Still tucked in her blanket, she crossed her arms, similar to a bat folding its wings around itself. "We are at war. There are enemies within the kingdom and the church, also those who slither in the dark as well. Though I cannot think of anyone specifically Ferdinand would have a personal vendetta against. The dark mages who attacked Lady Penelope all lay dead, and as far as I know, he does not know the identities of any further agents." Hubert's mouth pressed into a thin line, and his brow furrowed. "Has he ever done anything like this before?" asked Sylvain. Hubert frowned. He pinched the bridge of his nose, as the migraine scratching at his skull escalated into full-fledged hammers, pounding inside his head. "Ferdinand has always had a reckless side, though sneaking out in such a manner, even if it were to confront someone who had incurred his wrath, is highly uncharacteristic of him. Yeah, not to mention, Ferdinand isn't exactly the ruthless, vengeful type. I mean, sure, on the battlefield he can tear through enemy ranks like they're dried-up parchment paper, and I've seen him chew out people that have pissed him off. But this? With that amount of rage on his face?" Sylvain shook his head and sighed. "Whatever it is, it's personal." Hubert's own sigh matched the paladin's as he rested the side of his head against the curio once more. His eyes squeezed shut as he pressed his fingers against his temples, moving them in a circular motion as he attempted to massage away the scalding knives prying at his skull. "Have either of you two noticed him acting out of the ordinary lately?" Eileen suggested, her worried glance jumping between the two men. "As a matter of fact, I did notice him become rather taciturn later into the evening." Hubert sighed, shifting slightly so that his forehead was pressed against the glass one more. "I had intended to speak with him, ask if there was something troubling him. Foolishly, I let the matter slide as everyone retired for the evening." Not for the first time, Hubert internally kicked himself. The signs had been right in front of him. He knew something was off about Ferdinand, just like he had stood anxiously at the doorway of Hubert's room the day he wanted to share his worries of his mother's health. Ferdinand had been uncharacteristically tense and withdrawn, the joy that usually came naturally to him forced into place to uphold a sunny masquerade. And yet, just like with the incident that led Hubert to chasing Ferdinand down in Baramus, Hubert had remained stubbornly silent. He tapped his head against the curio, as if to rattle his thoughts loose. The clink of glass shaking sparked a memory from the previous day. Hubert turned to Eileen with wide eyes. "Mother, when we were speaking in the kitchen, Ferdinand dropped a teapot," Hubert said in rushed, near-breathless words. "Do you recall the topic of our conversation?" Eileen pursed her lips and furrowed her brow with a slight hum. "Well, we were discussing the possibility of Maddie and Theo joining the Imperial Army, a notion you were vehemently against, and you shared information about the faction you're hunting." Hubert frowned. Although the conversation had held a heavy weight for the mother and son, the topics discussed should not have affected Ferdinand in such a matter. Unless... His eyes went wide as realization clicked into place. "Towards the end of our conversation, we spoke briefly of Lady Penelope and the possibility of someone having passed on information of her crest to those who slither in the dark. Is it possible, in the moment he dropped the teapot, he may have deduced the identity of the one who betrayed his mother?" "Well, that would certainly send him out on a warpath, but do we have any idea who that might be?" Sylvain pointed out with a look of worry. "And with that, we return to our original dilemma." Hubert groaned. He squeezed his eyes shut and pressed a palm to his forehead. Teeth gritted to ward off the throbbing claws at his skull. "We have established motive for his sudden disappearance, but still remain without the slightest inkling of who the target may be." He turned to Eileen with a pleading look. "Mother, you have known Lady Penelope for years. Anyone willing to stoop low enough to hand her over to a malevolent cabal who would most certainly torture and kill her?" Eileen pursed her lips. She tapped at her chin, her face pinched with concentration. "I cannot think of a single person who would possibly—" Her eyes went wide. Rage washed across her face. Angry and bubbling just beneath the surface. A type of rage Hubert had only seen in her face when confronting her husband. She shook her head with a grimace and mumbled under her breath, "No, even he wouldn't." Eileen paused her musing. The fury combusted into an inferno. She ground her teeth and snarled, "No, he absolutely would. Mother? Ludwig." The single word was growled with every shred of malice she could coil together into a jagged blade of pure hatred. Fury that matched his mother's swelled up inside Hubert. He clenched his fists at his sides. Heat bloomed across his face, in patches of scorching, infuriated red. Of course, that putrid, conniving parasite would do something as heinous as to hand Lady Penelope over to a pack of foul, murderous conspirators. The answer had been so simple. Hubert internally berated himself for not reaching the conclusion himself. Mind filling in?" Sylvain frowned, eyes darting between the enraged mother and son with growing confusion. "Ludwig von Eyre, the former Duke of Eyre," Hubert explained, after taking a deep breath that did little to calm his nerves. The words were spoken in a clipped tone as his body vibrated with rage. "Wait, do you mean Ferdinand's father?" Sylvain's eyes went wide. "That vile, loathsome, contemptible—" Eileen paced the length of the room, her own fists clenched and her teeth gnashing. When she reached the far wall, she turned on her heel and began stalking in the opposite direction, her moves reminiscent of a caged panther. She quickly whirled on the two men, eyes blazing in fury. "Did you know the day Penelope and I met, that foul wretch had dragged her to a gala soon after she had suffered a miscarriage?" Eileen snapped, banging her fists against a nearby wall. Her body was far from having recovered, and she broke down in tears, in grief partway through the night. She should have been at home, healing and resting that night. Instead, Ludwig had insisted she be present at some superficial party, to be gawked at by the gossiping noble circles who are void of even the smallest traces of empathy, while her foul excuse of a husband paraded around like a show pony just to assuage his brittle, pathetic ego. "I was not aware of that, though I am not surprised in the slightest to hear of the former Duke's disregard for his wife's comfort and well-being," Hubert replied grimly, his voice tight. "Didn't he get arrested for treason?" Sylvain asked. "He did, and the accursed maggot remains a prisoner of the Empire to this day." Hubert glared at the box with its missing warp gem. He clenched his fists. until his nails dug crescent moon divots into his palms. If it had been up to me, I would have had the wretch executed years ago. Look, I've heard nothing but bad things about that asshole, but would he really stoop so low as to sell out his own wife to a pack of bloodthirsty cultists? Sylvain asked with an uneasy frown. Of that I have no doubt, Hubert growled. The former duke has always been an opportunistic bottom feeder. If an agent from those who slither in the dark happened to stop by his cell, waving the promise of freedom in exchange for information to further their cause, he would offer up Lady Penelope to the snakes, gift-wrapped with nary a second thought. Eileen growled at Hubert's words and resumed her pacing. By all the circles of hell, if I ever get my hands on that— Eileen? Hubert? The soft voice cut through the swirling maelstrom of vibrating fury that hung thick in the room like curdled milk. The three turned to see Penelope, limping toward them, clinging to the walls for support, and panting. Trembling, she paused for a moment to catch her breath, leaning against the doorframe, her back shuddering with every ragged gulp of air. Lank ginger hair fell over her face, the ends of the strands tangled into knots. She raised her head, staring at the others, with sharp, fiery eyes. "Penelope!" Eileen cried out. She strode across the room and reached out to help her friend. "We did not mean to wake. What happened to Ferdinand?" "And what does this have to do with Ludwig?" Penelope asked firmly. She pushed away from the wall, waving away Eileen's offer of assistance, and limped towards the curio where the others were standing. Hubert and his mother shared an uneasy glance before they turned to Lady Penelope with matching looks of consternation. "Lady Penelope," Hubert said with a heavy gulp, the words sticking to his throat like glue. "We have reason to believe that Ferdinand's sudden departure was—" "It was him, was it not?" Penelope's words sliced through the uneasy tension once more. She looked between Eileen and Hubert, with a face of resigned sadness. "Ludwig was the one who told those vile monsters of my crest." Hubert and Eileen both offered Penelope looks of sympathy. In a careful tone, Hubert continued, "Given the former duke's history of duplicitous arrangements and scheming, it is very likely that he provided intel to those who slither in the dark, intel that led to your attempted abduction, and it would seem as if Ferdinand has reached that conclusion as well." Tears quickly pooled in Penelope's eyes. She sniffled, her lips quivering as she held back a tiny sob. She lowered her head, ginger hair falling over and shielding her face once more, the shivers that had ensnared her frail body escalating into bone-rattling quaking. Eileen placed a gentling arm over her trembling shoulders. "Please, you must do something," Penelope begged in a soft voice. Hubert blinked at the request. "After everything he has done, do you truly care what happens to that—" "I do not give a possum's blistered backside what happens to Ludwig!" Penelope cried, her face red and tear-stained, twisted with fury and anguish. "I am worried about my son!" It was at that point that Penelope broke down and wept. She buried her face in her hands. Sobs shook her thin frame with an intensity that appeared nearly harsh enough to snap bones. Eileen's arm over her shoulders tightened and pulled Penelope into a hug. "Ferdinand, he always looked up to his father, tried so hard to impress him." The words were muffled, gasped between hiccuped sobs. Penelope pulled away from Eileen's embrace. She stared at Hubert with intense, red-rimmed eyes. "Please, do not let him face this alone." With 3 long strides, Eileen made her way back to the cabinet. Throwing open the curio, she reached inside and grabbed 2 of the gems. She marched over to Hubert and placed the gems firmly in his palm. "Here, both of you." She glanced between Hubert and Sylvain. "Take one of these gems to warp to Enbar at once. Use the other to get back." Hubert quickly looked between the 2 women, his mother's steely expression still rippling with cold rage, and rivets of tears rolling down Penelope's cheeks, but her face set determined, and nodded firmly. He slid one of the gems into his pocket, and held the other tightly in his hand. "Sylvain." Hubert nodded towards the paladin, who quickly walked to the mage's side. "So, how do these things work?" Sylvain frowned at the small ruby gem resting in Hubert's palm, and already glowing as if an ember was encased beneath its hard surface. The one controlling the gem merely needs to imagine the place they wish to warp to, very much the same way a regular warp spell is conducted, a bit without the incantation and the required faith magic aptitude. The one controlling the gem merely needs to imagine the place they wish to warp to, very much the same way a regular warp spell is conducted, a bit without the incantation and the required faith magic aptitude, Hubert explained. He stared down at the red jewel. The gem already felt warm, though it was difficult to know whether that was due to the magic swelling within the artifact or the sweating of the mage's palms. The magic is substantial enough to transport 2 or 3 people, providing the additional travelers are maintaining physical contact with the caster. Sylvain nodded and grabbed onto Hubert's arm. "And this'll get us all the way to Enbar?" he asked with a skeptical, raised brow. Hubert nodded. The distance would have been far too great for a regular warp spell, but the Morphisi warp gems were crafted and enhanced with magic that was ancient and rarely seen outside the foreign nation. That said, the gems could only be used once. Although Hubert would not want to attempt warping much further with the gems, reaching Enbar would not be a problem. Hubert focused on the tiny gem, pictured his personal quarters in the palace, nondescript, with only simple furniture filling its interior. He pictured appearing in the middle of the room, the heavy crimson rug trimmed with black under his feet. The muted glow of the gems flared into a corona of near-blinding scarlet light. Hubert felt Sylvain's fingers dig into his arm. The red glow bloomed and swirled around them, surrounding the men in a cocoon of spiraling red lights. Through the pulsing, spinning lights, Hubert glanced over at his mother, who offered him an encouraging nod. At her side, Penelope watched Hubert with wide, pleading eyes. A small smile graced her face. "Thank you," Penelope whispered to them, as the lights wrapped around the 2 men and spirited them to their new destination. The sensation was hardly different from a standard warp spell, a split second of weightlessness, not the sickening free fall of plummeting from a tall cliff, nor the uneasy airborne waltz of flight. It was as if gravity ceased to exist, as if Hubert were floating in some sort of void. The sensation vanished nearly as quickly as it appeared. The cyclone of crimson lights unfurled and faded away, revealing the interior of Hubert's personal quarters at the palace. Hubert unclenched his hand and held the warp gem. The rock had faded to a dull gray, its magic depleted. He glanced at Sylvain, who was still clinging to his arm, his eyes squeezed shut. Cautiously, one of the paladin's eyes flicked open, and he glanced around the room. The uneasiness on his face quickly shifted to astoundment. "Damn," Sylvain whistled. "Not sure if I'd want to do that all the time, but I would have killed to have some of those gems to get out of Gautier territory in my teenage years. Of that I have no doubt. Come, the dungeons lay this way." Hubert nodded over his shoulder for Sylvain to follow. They moved quickly through the palace halls. Curious eyes flicked in their direction, watching the minister of the imperial household race through the halls with a Fargus paladin in tow. Hubert paid them no heed and pressed on to their destination. "So, I gotta say," Sylvain said as he kept pace with Hubert's long strides, "given how much of a piece of shit Lugrig is, couldn't we just let Ferdinand, Sylvain drew a finger across his neck, pantomiming the motion of someone getting their throat slit. Some gagging noises were included with the gesture. "I spoke nothing of stopping Ferdinand," Hubert growled, "though, no matter how this confrontation may go, this will be a matter that weighs on him heavily. He will need our support. As Lady Penelope said, although that vile leech did not deserve an ounce of his son's respect or adoration, a betrayal of this magnitude will still be devastating to Ferdinand." The only reason the despicable worm still drew breath was because Ferdinand had spoken on the former duke's behalf, pleading that his father be spared and placed in a prison cell rather than be executed for treason, a leniency that Hubert now deeply regretted. He raced down the stairs leading to the palace's lower levels. The room the former duke was being incarcerated in was among the more comfortable of prison cells, well furnished with a proper bed, tables, and lighting, intended to temporarily hold high-ranking officials who were suspected of dubious acts while they awaited sentencing. As far as Hubert was concerned, the maggot should have been chained up in the cold, damp bowels of the palace with the roaches and rats. 2 guards stood by the entrance to the hallway that led to Ludwig's cell, both of them relaxed and chatting with one another. "Has General Eyre been through here?" Hubert asked the guards curtly. "Marquis Vestra!" The closest guard jumped and bowed at the mage. "Yes, General Lyre just passed by. He wished to speak with the prisoner." Hubert was already racing down the hall before the guard could finish getting the words out. The door to Ludwig's cell was ajar. There were no sounds coming from the other side. Hubert took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The bitter scent of copper slammed into his senses immediately. Hubert peered inside the darkened room, his eyes widening at the sight before him. Inside the cell, Ferdinand stood over the decapitated body of his father, a bloodied poleaxe in his shaking hand. Ragged breaths racked the Holy Knight's chest, tattered, heaving gasps, with no proper cadence that sounded more like a cacophony of beast growls. His face twisted into an unrecognizable snarl of murderous rage. More splatters of blood were splashed across his face and the front of his tunic. "Shit," Sylvain breathed, his eyes wide at the sight of the carnage. Numbly, Ferdinand turned to face the newcomers. The rage on his face quickly melted into pale shock. He took a shaky step forward and staggered near immediately, his legs buckling and nearly giving out like a collapsing pole tent. Hubert reached out, placing his hands on the paladin's shoulders and steadying his balance. He could feel Ferdinand quaking beneath his arms. It was him," Ferdinand shuddered, the words cracking with the beginning threads of hysteria. "He did it!" "Sylvain," Hubert turned sharply to the other knight, his words brisk. "Head to Garreg Mach at once. Take one of the wyverns to get there faster. Her Majesty must be informed of what has transpired. I'll stay here with Ferdinand." "Yeah." Sylvain gulped with a heavy nod. His eyes darted between the two men and the corpse whose blood was quickly staining the carpet. "I'll leave you to it." The heavy clank of armored footsteps that gradually faded away alerted Hubert to Sylvain's departure, but the mage's eyes remained fixed on Ferdinand. "Ferdinand?" No response. Ferdinand stood there, silently, his body quaking. He continued to stare at the corpse at his feet. Hubert took a hesitant step closer. "Ferdinand?" He tried again. A sniffle, followed by a tiny whimper this time. Hubert pulled himself closer, squeezing the comforting hand that he had placed on Ferdinand's shoulder. The paladin trembled under his touch, as if his whole body were ensnared in a seismic wake. "He did not even pretend. Said she was going to die anyway," Ferdinand gasped, his words whispered and barely audible between heaving sobs. He ducked his head, curtains of greasy copper hair hanging down and shielding his tear-stained face from Hubert. Hubert remembered where he was, his hands still holding onto the quivering shoulders. Very slightly, he could feel Ferdinand lean into the touch. "I'm sorry you had to face this alone," Hubert said softly. He gave the shaking shoulder another squeeze. "I should have been there with you." Another sniffle. Ferdinand roughly wiped his face with the back of his hand. Another broken sob rattled in his chest. "Would you have stopped me if you had arrived sooner?" Ferdinand hiccuped. The words clipped, scarred like dented armor. "No," Hubert said simply, his voice growing dark. "In fact, I likely would have encouraged you." It was at that point that Ferdinand broke down completely. The poleaxe fell from his hand and clattered to the ground. He buried his face in both his palms and sobbed openly. Hesitantly, Hubert closed the last gap of distance, wrapped his arms around Ferdinand, and held him close. "He always treated her so horribly. You were right about him. Everyone was right about him. It was terrible. He always was. I knew he was terrible as well. And yet—" Ferdinand's words trailed off into another avalanche of shattered sobs. He tucked his face against Hubert's shoulder, the sound muffled slightly. A growing damp patch spread across the fabric of Hubert's tunic, as cascades of tears poured from the eyes of the weeping paladin. Children always look to seek the approval and praise of their parents, no matter how reprehensible those parents may be, Hubert said softly, one hand rubbing soothing circles across Ferdinand's back, the other gently stroking his hair. As he spoke, the rancid taste of the sticky toffee clung like glue to his mouth, the sweet treats offered in a hand that had been the source of leagues more cruelty than comfort. Hubert pushed the memory away with a shuddering breath and held Ferdinand close. Eventually, Ferdinand pulled away slightly, not enough to fully break the embrace, but giving himself enough room to lift his head and look Hubert in the eye. "I do not know if you were aware, but I had been building a legal case against him. I had found evidence of him committing tax fraud prior to my enrolling in the academy." Ferdinand sniffled. His voice, although cracked, was clear, much closer to its usual confidence, and her eyes were still bloodshot and welled with tears, but they held Hubert's gaze unflinchingly. "I wanted to do things properly, as a noble should, go through the proper channels, ensure he had a fair trial, and that justice would be served accordingly. I was so mad when I found out Edelgard had arrested him. I wanted to prove that I was not like him, that I would ensure he would be held accountable for his crimes, and show that the new generation of the Eyre family would not tolerate such abhorrent, underhanded dealings. A part of me thought he would somehow change, that perhaps time in prison would humble him, become closer to the noble idol I naively thought him to be as a child. What a fool I was." Ferdinand shuddered, his fingers digging into Hubert's back like talons. "And because I insisted he be kept alive. My mother, she was nearly... I thought it would be difficult, but it just happened." Ferdinand gasped in a broken whisper against Hubert's shoulder. "I was so angry. It was so simple." The paladin clung to him for a time, body quaking, and hiccuped sobs rattling in his chest. Hubert kept his arms tightly wrapped around the man. He wanted to say something, offer some word of comfort, but his mind remained a cloud of blank static. Unable to voice his concern for the other man, Hubert held him tighter, pouring as much comfort as possible into that embrace, hoping his arms would convey even a fraction of the care he wanted to show the weeping paladin. Ludwig did not deserve Ferdinand's tears, and Ferdinand was allowed to grieve for the loss of a father, not the headless corpse lying at his feet, but the idea of him that a much younger, hopeful Ferdinand had created in his mind and desperately hoped would eventually become a reality. After a time, Ferdinand pulled away. Once more, he met Hubert's gaze, though this time his face was pinched with panic. "Hubert!" Ferdinand swallowed heavily and watched Hubert with feral eyes. "He said the one who offered him this deal was someone with close ties to Edelgard, an Adrestian noble, but he would not say who." Scalding rage stabbed through Hubert's core like a barbed arrow. He forced back the urge to snarl. Arundel. Of course Thallas would be the one reaching out to Ludwig personally. None of the guards would bat an eye at Lord Arundel, wanting to speak with a prisoner. And it would be just like Thallas to twist the blade further by employing the aid of someone who had already done irreparable harm to Lady Edelgard and Adrestia as a whole. "Thank you, Ferdinand." Hubert swallowed, carefully schooling his voice into an even tone. "We will make sure to take extra diligence and be on the lookout for any visiting members of the nobility displaying suspicious behavior." Ferdinand hummed and nodded dumbly. The usually vibrant man hollowed out and reduced to a husk, his face red and blotchy, eyes red-rimmed and swollen. He sniffled and wiped the beads of tears clinging to his eyelashes. "I should return to your mother's cottage," Ferdinand rasped. "I owe my mother a proper goodbye, as well as owe your mother an apology for stealing one of her possessions. I assure you that my mother is in no way upset about the warp gem." Hubert's hand returned to Ferdinand's shoulder as he offered the man a small smile. "She is only concerned as to your well-being." A touch of relief eased the worried creases lining Ferdinand's face. He quickly nodded, then shyly flicked his gaze up at Hubert. "You will be accompanying me?" Ferdinand asked hesitantly, watching Hubert with hopeful eyes. "Only if you want. I imagine you will need to report what transpired to Edelgard." Hubert raised his hand. Ferdinand's panicked reassurances went quiet. "I have already sent Sylvain to inform Her Majesty. He is on the way to Garreg-Mach as we speak. We can spare a few days to return to the cottage," Hubert assured him in a gentle tone, the beginning of a wry smile tilting the corners of his mouth. "Plus, I would imagine Matilda would feed me to that blasted reptile of hers if I were to sneak off without a proper goodbye. And it is most fortuitous for us that my mother provided us with a spare warp gem. We can return there immediately." A tiny smile touched the corners of Ferdinand's mouth. Not enough to erase the cloying strands of distress, but some light did return to his face. "Thank you," he breathed. "Your support means everything to me." Hubert nodded and swallowed thickly. With his hand gently resting on Ferdinand's back, the two men made their way from the dungeon. Hubert reached into his pocket for the gem that would carry them back to the cottage. "We are still waiting to hear back from our scouts who have been sent to investigate the garrisons of soldiers stationed outside the monastery, but as of this time, no suspicious activity has been detected in Garreg Mach, though we will be carefully monitoring any visiting members of the nobility." Lady Edelgard said the words with a pointed side glance and a nod to Hubert as she spoke. The message was clear enough. Arundel had done nothing to retaliate as of yet in response to the failed capture of Lady Penelope, as well as the execution of his informant. The revelation did nothing to ease Hubert's nerves. The slimy wretch was likely just biding his time, waiting for a fleeting moment of vulnerability to strike. As powerful as those who slither in the dark were, they did not dare engaging in open warfare against the Empire, while the Church and Kingdom remained a threat. Still, the lack of Thalus's skulking presence in the monastery grounds sat unpleasantly in Hubert's stomach. He had no doubt the foul maggot was up to something. Hubert and Ferdinand had just returned to Garreg Mach. They, as well as Lady Edelgard, the professor, and several others immediately set up a meeting to discuss the recent events and the threat they posed against the Empire. "Mark my words," Lady Edelgard continued, a threatening growl seeping into her tone. "These threats against the family members of our army's officers will not be taken lightly. Those responsible will be found and punished accordingly." Lady Edelgard turned to Ferdinand, her face soft with sympathy. "Ferdinand, I am truly sorry for all the pain and hardship you and your mother have gone through these past couple weeks. If there is anything I can do to help, you need only ask." "I thank you for your kind words, Edelgard," Ferdinand answered with a wan smile. "I do apologize for all the trouble my actions have caused." "Ferdinand, you did nothing wrong," Lady Edelgard sighed. "You executed a traitor. Nothing more." "Be that as it may, I still went ahead and passed sentencing without the proper—" "Ferdinand!" Edelgard pinched the bridge of her nose, barely contained exasperation shaking her voice. "Ludwig von Eyre was guilty of the crimes that would have warranted his execution several times over. Please, let the matter rest. The only thing I regret is that it was your hand that was forced to wield the executioner's blade." Ferdinand sighed, but nodded heavily. Dark circles hung under his eyes like bruised halos. Strands of frizzy, copper hair lay askew around his shoulders, like tangles of frayed vines. His body drooped with steadily growing fatigue, wobbling slightly, and placing a hand on the table to keep his balance. "Very well. I thank you for your support, Edelgard. It means a lot," Ferdinand said with a tired smile. "Of course, but please, get some rest, my friend," Lady Edelgard said in a firm tone, but one threaded with warmth. "We will be marching to Fargus within the next couple of days, and it will do us no good if one of our top generals collapses from exhaustion." Ferdinand opened his mouth as if to protest, but stayed quiet when he noticed the pointed looks both Edelgard and Hubert were directing at him. He sighed, but managed a weak chuckle. "You make a fair point. I would hate to become the laughingstock of the Imperial Army by passing out and falling off my horse in the middle of combat. Thank you," he said with a bow. "I will see you all in the morning." Ferdinand nodded to the small group clustered around the war council table. He offered a warm smile to Hubert as he passed by, and departed for his personal quarters. Recovery would still take time. It was clear that the events over the past few weeks had taken a heavy toll, but over the journey from the Vester cottage to Garreg Mach, the color gradually returned to Ferdinand's face, restoring his cheeks closer to that familiar, sun-kissed freckled bronze. Amber eyes, though still dulled with grief, had reclaimed some tiny specks of fire, warming Hubert's chest at their very sight. The heavy sloths of fatigue remained, but Ferdinand no longer appeared quite so shattered. Ferdinand and Penelope had clung to each other, weeping upon their return to the cottage. Both of them whispered apologies that the other assured were not needed. Even in prison the last 5 years, Ludwig von Eyre had remained a looming spectre of them both, the condescending taunts from the vile parasite, leaving lasting scars on the Eyre mother and son. As expected, Ferdinand had gone to Eileen, apologizing profusely for the stolen warp gem and offering her monetary compensation. She had waved away Ferdinand's attempts at penance, insisting that none were needed, and she was just glad to see he was safe. She waved away Ferdinand's attempts at penance, insisting that none were needed, and she was just glad to see that he was safe. Hubert's mother had tried to offer them an additional warp gem to return to the monastery. Given the gem's rarity, and that there were hardly any remaining, he declined the offer. Eileen, Penelope, Matilda, and Theodore had all given hugs to both Hubert and Ferdinand as they left to depart. "Do try not to let another 5 years pass before you visit us again." Eileen had scowled at Hubert, but quickly swept him into a warm, tearful embrace. "Be safe, dearest." The journey back to Garrigmach had been largely composed of comfortable silence. Ferdinand needed time to process everything that had happened, and Hubert was there to provide a sympathetic ear to any thoughts Ferdinand wished to share. The words Ferdinand had shared during the travels were sparse, heavy, as if each syllable contained the weight of an anchor, but delivered with earnest. He had shared with Hubert a sliver of the tumultuous thoughts swirling within him, thoughts Ferdinand normally would have kept carefully sealed behind a mask of forced cheerfulness, confided to Hubert with an openness and trust that warmed the mage. Shortly after Ferdinand departed, the meeting came to a close. Hubert left the War Council chambers. Sylvain, who had been present at the meeting as well, quickly joined Hubert's side as the mage made his way down the hall. "Hey, how's Ferdinand doing? He looked a little rough." Sylvain frowned, his face pinched with worry. "I'd ask him myself, but he didn't look like he was up to talking to anyone. Can't say I blame him. Although I cannot provide specific details as to Ferdinand's feelings regarding his father's death, as those are his own personal thoughts to share if he so pleases," Hubert said solemnly. "I will say that he is healing from the incident. It will take time for him to fully recover, but Ferdinand has always been a man of great resilience. He will emerge from this, just as he does anything else." Sylvain nodded, heavy with a low hum, going quiet as he walked at Hubert's side. Hubert raised an eyebrow at the paladin, noting his usually grave demeanor. "Have Ingrid and Felix returned from their scouting duties at the Fargus border?" Hubert asked. "Huh?" Sylvain blinked like a startled owl. "Oh, yeah, they're back. Still not much movement out there. Dimitri's forces have probably pulled back to Arian Road and some of the kingdom's other fortresses, especially those along the coast of the Whitehorn Sea. They're probably expecting us to attack by water and make a beeline for Ferdinand. Any word of suspicious activity concerning our group of interest?" Hubert asked in a low voice. "Nothing yet," Sylvain grimaced. "Based on everything you told me about them, those bastards are pretty sneaky. Who knows what they've got cooking behind our backs?" Hubert hummed grimly in response. Another beat of silence floated between them. "Look, I've been meaning to ask this for a while, and you can tell me to piss off if you don't want to answer. I get it," Sylvain said in a strangled voice. His jaw was clenched, and his gaze was carefully averted from Hubert. Hubert was tempted to make a quip about Sylvain never being hesitant to badger him with personal questions before in the past, but stayed his comment, as he noticed the rigid posture and tense behavior of the Fargus paladin. He nodded at Sylvain to continue. Sylvain took a deep, shuddering breath, then, in quivering words, voiced his question. "What's it like killing your old man?" Hubert blinked, confused by the question at first. Suddenly, the meaning behind such an inquiry clicked into place. "You believe you will be facing your father in combat once we march into Fargus?" Sylvain grimaced, his face crinkled as threads of distress wove their way through his features. "Stuff with Ferdinand and his dad? It got me thinking, and... Look, I know we're in a war, and I'm not regretting the side I chose. But I'm also not naive about what's likely to happen once we start facing off against the bulk of the kingdom's army." Sylvain winced, his face pained. "Dimitri will send out a call for aid, and House Gautier will respond. We always have." The final couple of words were barely above a whisper. Sylvain ducked his head with another ragged sigh. "I cannot provide an answer to your question that will be satisfactory," Hubert said softly, sympathetic frown. "Although we both hold troublesome histories with our fathers, the differences are not unsubstantial. I cannot guarantee a confrontation with your father will resemble mine in any way, nor how you will feel in its aftermath." Images from the not-so-distant past flashed in Hubert's mind, the sight of the old Marquis just standing there, and not raising a single hand to defend himself, staring at Hubert with resignation, as the blade plunged into his chest. The strange sense of emptiness that followed, as Hubert gazed into the lifeless eyes that had watched him with such cruelty, the illusion of the terrifying monster dispelled, leaving only the corpse of a broken man in its wake. Hubert grit his teeth and pushed the memory away, redirecting his attention to Sylvain. He did not know much about Matthias Gautier, but he did know the Margrave's neglect of parenting towards his youngest son provided ample opportunities for Miquelon to rain substantial amounts of abuse on his younger brother. Hubert would not have blamed Sylvain for wanting retribution for the gross negligence he was subjected to as a child. The paladin trailed along beside him, listless, dragging steps that were void of their usual energy. "I figured you'd say something like that," Sylvain sighed, shoulders drooping, and his head hung. "There will be many battalions engaged in combat once we cross the border. There is no guarantee that you will be the one facing your father," Hubert pointed out. "Yeah, I know." Sylvain sighed. Suddenly, his head shot up, and he stared at Hubert with eyes of cold steel. "But if he does show up in a battle I'm fighting in, I'll be the one to deal with him." Hubert held the intense gaze for a moment, before nodding. "I understand," the mage responded. "Though if you do choose to confront your father, do know that you do not have to do so alone. There are many among the imperial ranks who would happily assist you, myself included." "Yeah, I know," Sylvain mumbled with a weak chuckle. "Anyways, thanks for listening to me ramble. I should probably hit the hay as well." As he went to leave, Sylvain paused and turned to Hubert once more. "Hey, by the way, next time you speak with your mom and siblings, tell 'em I said thanks," Sylvain said quietly, with a melancholy smile. "It was nice, feeling like I was part of a family again." "I will be sure to pass on your words of gratitude to them," Hubert smiled, with a nod to the paladin. "I wish you a good evening." Sylvain grinned and waved over his shoulder as he took off towards his dormitory room, the clang of armored steps echoing down the hallway. With that, Hubert stalked in the direction of his own personal quarters to plan for what lay ahead. The war was far from over, and there was still much to prepare.